My name is Angelina. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I will be the moderator of today's panel. And it's already 3:05, so I think we'll just get started with today's panel. We'll record today's session so that other students, staff, or faculty who couldn't make it today will get a chance to watch the recording instead. So if you don't want to be on camera, feel free to just stop video great. Okay, so hi everyone. For those people who just joined, welcome to the Gender and Sexuality Issue-Based panel. For today's panel, we'll feature representatives from a number of community organizations, Inside Out Youth Services, Haseya Advocate Program, and CASA, which stands for Colorado Coalition Against Sexual Assault. The SARC, Sexual Assault Response Coordinator, and Thompson at Colorado College is also joining us as one of the panelists to share thoughts on work at CC. So I just want to begin with a thank you to all the panelists for sharing their time and expertise with us. Our hope for today's panel is to give you a sense of place in this community and to help you see how gender and sexuality plays out locally in Paso County or in Colorado Springs, and how you may get involved in minimal work to address it. So my name is Angelina. I'm one of the CCE's issue organizers. My role is to act as a coalition builder and connector to deepen and inspire work, specifically in gender and sexuality at CC and beyond. So this is one of the 9 issue-based panels we'll be hosting over Block 5 and 6. And we do want to invite you all to attend all of them that interest you in the coming weeks. So through this, like panels like this, or like educational events or coalition building work we're doing at CCE, we want to better coordinate and spread awareness of what our campus and community are doing, are already doing, and how to better communicate these efforts to a larger public, to a larger audience, and especially the student body at CC. So feel free to reach out to me directly or look up coalitions on the CC website, or one of the facilities here today will just drop the link to the chat box so you can join the coalition and get more involved in work like this in the future. So we're excited that you're here, and we'll now begin with intros. So, and following that, we'll spend about 30 minutes on discussions, and we'll keep it more conversational. So all attendants can feel free to just drop questions or comment in the chat box, and our panelists will respond to these reactions or answer questions in the Q&A session after that. So first, please, our panelists, share your name, pronouns, the organization you're representing, or the type of community work you engage in, what you do, and what your organization focuses on. So there's no order, so please just feel free to jump in.
Sure, I can start. My name is Anna Thompson. My pronouns are she, hers. I'm the Sexual Assault Response Coordinator at Colorado College. My main role is supporting people directly affected by gender-based violence, but also helping to create a supportive, trauma-informed community at Colorado College, and also work on sexual violence prevention. Before this position, I've been doing advocacy for about 7 years, originally as a volunteer, and then I worked at the Rape Crisis Center in Columbus, Ohio, my hometown, and then moved out here to do similar work here at Colorado College. So Yeah, thanks for having me, Angelina.
Oh, I can go next. Hello, everybody. Maria Mendez, she, her pronouns. I'm the Training and Technical Assistance Manager with Sexuality, the Colorado Coalition Against Sexual Assault. I've been there for just over 2 years now. My 2-year anniversary was in September. And before that, I was at CC in Anna's role. And before that, I was in California at a domestic violence sexual assault program there doing prevention work. So I'm excited to be back on campus, see a few familiar faces, and see CASA, what we do. We're a statewide coalition, so we work with member organizations around the state. CC is a member of ours as part of our campus members. So essentially what we do is we unite voices of the folks that are doing the work around the state. We don't do any direct service, but we do provide support to those who are doing that direct service around the state. We provide technical assistance, training. We also do some work at the Capitol with legislation, policy, things like that. And essentially we just make program voices and survivor voices heard around the state. So again, happy to be here.
Hi, my name is Goddess Tyescha. My pronouns are she, her, they, them, Goddess, and Tyescha. Feel free to use any of those. I am the amplifier of health advocacy at Inside Out Youth Services. We do direct services where we generally have a drop-in center, which is right now on Discord, and we serve ages 13 to 24. If you don't know about Inside Out, where have you been? The reality is that Inside Out is actually the only youth LGBTQ center in El Paso County. So we do that direct service. My personal involvement is actually all the outside things that come in, which can be resources, which means that I do trainings around LGBTQ competency and also building trusted adults so that we can build as many safe spaces. I also do policy work around all gender restrooms, but also around sexual violence. I also do the Safe at Schools Coalition, which does hotspotting and certain things to actually evaluate how safe El Paso County is, and then also bring down the numbers of unsafe places and build more safe places in El Paso County. My background is actually not in sexual violence. I'm a formal teacher of 8 years. I taught history at District 20 and AP psychology and many other things amongst that. But I do have 20 years of organizing within the school to prison pipeline, environmental justice, and the original DREAM Act between New York City, Philly, Boston, and DC. So I've done a lot of policy work around that stuff.
I think I'm the last one on here. So my name is Monycka Snowbird. I'm the program director for the Haseya Advocate Program. We do direct services for Native survivors of sexual assault, domestic violence, and stalking. We do not, and we don't use pronouns because pronouns are a colonial construct. In Ojibwe culture, we only use they, them, all of them are that way. So, and I think we should take a second to acknowledge that the fact that we are all sitting here in Colorado Springs, we are here directly in a violation of the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty and some of the treaties that took place after 1879, after the Meeker Massacre. So we are standing here or sitting here at our kitchen tables on traditional Ute, Cheyenne, Lakota, Kiowa, and Arapaho land. So, and again, our program does do direct services. We do everything from protection orders to safety plans, lethality assessments to butchering buffalo and kayaking and everything there in between. So we also manage a indigenous healing garden called Pieth Ketnanoth, which means in the Ute language, it's the plants that heal. That is one of 3 spaces in the state off the reservation that are specific for indigenous people. And it's like the size of probably most of your backyards. So, and we're based here in Colorado Springs.
Thank you, Monycka, for addressing that. And I do want to make a note that this is the Black History Month this month. And a lot of, like the Black Student Union and a number of students have put together events. And and display. There's a memorial artwork on display in Warner. So if students are on campus, if you pass by Warner, please go to look at it and keep that in mind. And yeah, so now we'll just go dive into the questions. So there's no order of like answering these questions, and feel free to respond to other people's answers. And so the first one is, I want to just contextualize gender, like work against sexual violence, sexual assault in El Paso County or in Colorado Springs. So please help us understand the local context of it, including why gender-based violence exists and matters in Colorado Springs, especially how this compares to the national or international context or levels. So feel free to share statistics like from the work you do in your organization, but also what you've learned about this issue through daily experiences in your work.
I feel like we could all talk for like the rest of this panel on this subject, so I'll just jump in. So I'll speak specifically to the Native issues and let everyone else cover the other aspects of things. So violence against Indigenous women specifically exists because of Christopher Columbus's legacy, essentially. The first violence and trafficking that took place against Native women happened in 1492. He actually wrote about it in his books, talked about trafficking 8 and 9-year-olds. So why that has continued is because there's been a legacy of dehumanizing and objectifying and hypersexualizing Indigenous women. If you look at Pocahontas or the Pocahontas kind of costumes, there's no accurate sense in what that, and how that actually represents who our people are. So statistically, 4 out of 5 Indigenous women will experience violence at some point in their life. 2 out of 3 will experience rape or domestic violence. So those rates are significantly higher than all other populations. We also have a higher rate of missing and murdered Indigenous relatives happening right now. People say epidemic, but it's not an epidemic. That's a naturally occurring thing that couldn't have been prevented. This could have been prevented. Our system has chosen not to do that. So it's a crisis. It's an emergency. It's not an epidemic. So locally, those statistics kind of play the same way. Like, I don't know many Native women who aren't survivors of some sort of intimate partner violence. And so we do work with people who are formally in our program and then our community as a whole to kind of build those gaps and to lessen that isolation and recreate some of those anti-type relationships that we have if you're living in a reservation community. So let's see, I'm reading the question again. What I've learned about this issue that you couldn't learn in a book is that traditional advocacy and mainstream advocacy isn't enough. You can't just give people a stack of resources and say, good luck. You can't just show up at court, sit in the back of the room and expect a survivor to be able to handle that on her own. You really have to do what we call creating a sister space and walking through this entire process with someone, and not just like warm handoffs, but like literally accompanying them, and not making what we have found works best for healing in our communities is culturally centered teachings, where it's not everything in a boardroom, everything in a conference room. We don't, we go outside, we go hiking, we go kayaking, we forage plants. I mean, we do all of the things you would do with your friends and with your family or your relatives, and that is where people find those healing at that way. And so it's really creating those relationships, and you don't get those relationships in systems advocacy, I don't believe. Like there's a place for that, but that's the difference between confidential advocates and non-confidential advocates. So like court advocates, CSPD advocates, they do great work, but it's short-term. There's no long-term relationship building. I would never want to work in those fields. Like, I love the fact that I have ladies in our program from 3 years ago. And they all know where I live, so I'm never going to be able to get rid of any of them. So, but that's some of the things that we found, that to really make genuine change and to offer some really safe spaces for healing, you have to throw some of those boundaries that are taught and reinforced in mainstream programs. You have to throw them out the window because how is that going to work for anybody? So I'll just shut up now so we can go on to the next.
Monica, that was great. I think that really made me think in a more complex way of the work that I'm doing, because I think that it's not as, it hasn't been a traditional route that we've gone through at IOIS as we're still branching into what the queer community needs. So when I think of this question, I really think contextually of the fact that comprehensive sexual education is not given in our society, let alone El Paso County. When we talk about like genitalia, when we talk about like the biology of folks, like most people graduate from high school without knowing their own body, but can tell you the date and time and can tell you probably all the pieces of a jellyfish, but don't know actually the pieces of their body. It's pretty insane to me when we think about our educational system and how they show up in that way. And so part of that in Inside Out has been, how do we, as the queer community, because we're not getting comprehensive sexual education, and in that comprehensive sexual education or the sexual education that is being given, it actually isn't talking about queer people or talking about biology half of the time. So therefore, how do we bridge that gap? So one of the things that we've bridged the gap, because the reality is that we're all suffering as human beings on human interaction, and how to have healthy relationships is so hard because we haven't been taught emotional intelligence. The reality is that at Inside Out, we've been teaching those skills for a long time through like a smart hearts type of understanding, because we started to see so many young people in toxic relationships, because the reality is that statistically we know that the queer community doesn't have a lot of options as to friends making. And what ends up happening is that a queer person will make one friend, that friend might become a partner, and in that codependency, we see a lot of toxicity that might happen, such as abuse. And because it's not as traditional as we know abuse and sexual abuse and verbal abuse and emotional abuse to be, it's very hard to connect to. So one of the things that we started, I would say, is through that educational lens of educating young people. The things that I currently do right now has to do with actually pushing our, right now policy was pushed last year that we have to give comprehensive sexual education that is going to include not only queer people, but are going to include all of my intersectionalities of being Latinx and being a Black feminine presenting person. At the end of the day, what we have to realize is that, first of all, schools are not doing that. They can opt out. And second of all, what we see is that actually, if we have comprehensive sexual education in the school system, it shows that women that are 18 are 40% less likely to engage in sexual violence. That is an easy fix for a big issue. Like it literally shows statistically, if we teach people how to say no and yes and respect each other's boundaries, we can eradicate sexual violence. But we're nowhere near that, I would say, as a society, unfortunately, because we haven't quite bridged that gap as to like, this is the need base of the community and this is where it starts, right? If you've ever heard of our Whole Lives program, it is through the Unitarian Church, and it is given. My kids took it when they were in kindergarten. It was like, we're gonna use words like penis, right? Like that is your genitalia. So things like that can prevent, and those are the things that we're working on at Inside Out. I would also say we're starting to now work on policy, because we're noticing that the reality is that if in Colorado State, you do not get physically assaulted, the likeliness of CSPD and the DA office going anywhere with your case is 0 to none, which means someone can put a gun to your head and make you perform fellatio, and the likeliness of them doing anything to that person is so low. You can actually get stalked in El Paso County and nothing actually happened, because the reality is that we don't have policy and laws to stop folks from doing these things. And even for heterosexuals, this is a problem. And then also for the queer community, this is a huge red flag, because the reality is that we do not take physical to have a sexual relationship, right? There might be no physical attribute to sex for us. So how do we show there's been sexual violence, right? When sex looks very different. And the reality is that that's one of the things I guess that I've learned in my role, is that we have policy that's not written to keep people secure and safe. And so we are really struggling as a state. I come originally from Harlem, New York, so from like New York City, which, not saying anything, what it takes to push a case in sexual violence in El Paso County would mean that you would have assault, battery, possibly an attempted murder, and sexual violence for it to actually hold on. We are also building a lot of competency around the queer community because terminology is important. And so in the trans and non-binary, in the trans umbrella, including non-binary folks, we're seeing that policy is not written for them also, including the fact that people do not have paperwork for them to identify themselves as their preferred name or their preferred pronoun or however they see their gender and sexuality. So these are huge gaps that we're seeing on a policy level. On top of the fact that like we know that these numbers are way higher when you add BIPOC folks and sexual violence, like those numbers are astonishing. So the reality is that this is a huge problem in all of the intersectionalities.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things, first of all, ditto Monycka, ditto Tyescha, right? That's one of the things that we're really working towards, and that's been a shift in my lens from being at CICASA, is that we have been very siloed. We have been working in this very white supremacist culture and the way that we do things, mainly because of our funding. We're mostly government funded. We have, very specific restrictions on, how to engage and who to engage with. But we're really working towards, programs like Inside Out that are more comprehensive and more holistic, and not just folks, not just domestic violence, sexual assault programs around the state. And that's been really helpful and beneficial. We work a lot with an anti-oppressive framework, because we know that if we can't end oppression generally, if we can't end racism, we can't end, all of the isms, we're not going to end gender-based violence, right? Because they're all connected, coinciding. And so one of the things that I've really learned is how siloed this work has been, and that we need to do more partnerships. We need to be more holistic. We need to look at that comprehensive sex ed and how that ties healthy sexuality. We need to think about mentorship, which, might not even seem like prevention for some folks, but it is, right? It's all tied together. And so, yeah, I mean, like that's kind of what's come to mind for me. Also, statewide, Colorado more broadly, it's primarily rural and frontier. So there are several places in Colorado as a state that have less than six folks living per square mile. And that presents a lot of challenges as well, right? In terms of service provision, about capacity. And so that's when moving away from these silos becomes really important, and being able to partner to provide the best support and also to provide the best prevention.
Yeah, I also kind of want to speak to the local context of Colorado Springs. I've been here for 2 years. So the biggest thing when I came out here was the fact that there's 5 military installations in El Paso County. That's the most of any county in the United States. I bring that up because when we're talking about things, it's hard for me to talk about sexual violence and apart from domestic violence and things like child abuse. So for people, I don't know how familiar our audience is with the issue, but when we're talking about these things, we're talking about systems of domination, systems of oppression, such as racism, sexism, these things all in deep inequality. These are all things that make the foundation for this type of violence to happen, such as child abuse, sexual violence, and domestic violence. All of which, I'm not sure on sexual violence, but things like child abuse and domestic violence in Colorado Springs are well above the national average. I don't know if we've attributed that directly to the fact that, the military bases in the county, but we know, and this is a growing issue, about how high sexual violence is, the perpetration of sexual violence is in the military. So we could talk for hours, but it's interesting. Monycka just talked about how we're on stolen land, right? Native Americans. But then we have now, as I'm sorry, I'm getting all scattered because there's so many connections to make, but we have the military, which Martin Luther King Jr. called one of the biggest purveyors of violence in the world, right? We have 5 of those installations, right, where hierarchy and domination are central to how they operate. So, so I just wanted to add that context, because not only are there, victims with a lot of victims within the military, but, then we have people in the military interacting with the civilian population. So I just wanted to make that connection about the military here, just because as a new person here, that was really, it's kind of weird. It's weird here. It's a little weird here, right? And with the past year, with the rise of these right-wing militia groups and such, I mean, these are attempts to preserve white supremacy, which is very much connected to sexual violence, in the genocide of the attempted genocide of Native populations here. So I know I've like gone all over the place, but I think the main point I wanted to talk about was just like, that's pretty unique to El Paso County, the fact that there's 5 military installations here. So there's a large military population. And then the last thing I just wanted to say, with the last year, maybe you've heard, but like with the pandemic and the increased isolation of people, domestic violence calls to the hotline have gone way up. So just adding all of these things to our context is important to remember. The pandemic has really, I think this type of violence was at crisis level before the pandemic, but it's definitely brought attention, like a lot of people who weren't paying attention before have been learning about how bad it is. So yeah, just wanted to add that.
I just wanted to add to what Anna was saying. When we talk about toxic masculinity, also, we have to realize that it's plagued our whole society, right? Because sometimes we have this understanding of gender and sexuality of like, it has to be male and female, but the reality is that a lot of us, our other cultures also have decided that they were going to take on this toxic masculinity that then leads into these type of behaviors, right? So the reality of the Black male having toxic masculinity through colonization, heck yes. The reality of Latinx, that we know that machismo does exist, like that's the reality. Now we have more words to academically like connotate it, but in the queer community, we're seeing those type of behaviors as well, right? So if someone is seen as more masculine, they think that part of being more masculine is actually oppressing their partner, because that's what we've taught being more masculine is, right? Like when you think of those behaviors of women, go get me my lunch, or go do this and go do that, right? Like those type of oppression, we're seeing that in the queer community more and more. And so how do we decolonize every section of our society when we have these conversations? Because unfortunately, we haven't quite had a more robust understanding of that in the past.
And I think when we're talking about military bases too, besides the fact that Fort Carson is named after Fort Carson, who is, I mean, ew. He was and if some of these CC students aren't from here, they may not know the history that he was a famed Indian fighter and actually forced the Navajo or the Dene people on what they call the long walk. So he's awful. And the fact that we as a society thought that we should celebrate his accomplishments by naming a military base after him is a whole other thing. But if you look at Anna, Maria, and I are on the all advocacy committee for the city. And when we have when we used to be able to meet in person, we would have all these military people show up. And if you look at how many advocates there are at Tyescha, and including their volunteers, compared to how many advocates there are on Fort Carson, it is literally 3 times the amount. It might be 4, but I'm going to be conservative and say 3. And that's Tyescha is supposed to do the entire El Paso County, 700,000 people. And those advocates at Fort Carson are supposed to only work within Fort Carson. So obviously there's a horrifically toxic culture going on there that they would need that many advocates to respond to the cases that they have there. And El Paso County has one of the highest rates of dual arrests in domestic violence as well as a local issue, when that's where both partners get charged, because the cops will be like, I'm not going to deal with trying to figure out who's the abuser here, so I'm going to let a judge sort this out, which then snowballs. Because if you are a domestic violence survivor and now you are charged with domestic violence, let's say you're a teacher or a CNA or a medical assistant, or you work in a daycare center, you could lose your job because of that. And then you have to then, if those cases get dismissed, because we do have some solid judges here in Colorado Springs, luckily, knock on wood, we keep them. But if the judge sees right through that and throws your case out, it still shows up on a criminal report. So you have to pay $65 to get that sealed. So and then you have to pay another $28.70, $27.50, something like that, to get it sealed with the Colorado Bureau of Investigations. So even if you did nothing and you're a survivor, you're looking at easily $100 worth of just fees to get this off of your record when it should have never happened. So there's all these little things that play into it locally that snowball real quickly for our survivors. So, and then
go ahead.
And as far as in the LGBTQ Two-Spirit community, our local police really do not have an accurate sense of understanding for domestic violence. We have some of those cases that we're dealing with in our caseloads, and we see continually that the partner that they just in their heads identify as more masculine is getting charges or the brunt of the police investigation, when that person is actually the survivor or the victim in that domestic violence. So, and then they'll try to make it assault and not DV because, oh, you can't have domestic violence in a same-sex relationship. So there's a long way to go with our local police department in getting this kind of education to even have them understand domestic violence and sexual assault and how people don't necessarily recap those things in a linear way, and that stories change over a few days because of the trauma. But then on top of all that, to also learn, like, to understand the gender and sexuality and the difference between gender and sexuality and how they're not necessarily the same thing. That's like, we could do this 40 hours a week and still have more work to do with our local police and our local military bases on that. Look, we just took up half the thing on the first question.
Right. But also, just to add to Monycka's note, the reality is that 70% of our budget also is not going to the survivors. It is actually going to a system that perpetuates people being incarcerated. And a lot of money is going into that continuously, and it's a nice little running mill. And we're also seeing right now, they're doing many studies as a statewide, particularly the, CDPHE, Colorado Department of Public Health Environment. Why, I'm not sure why we would put that as an acronym, Colorado, but we're doing a lot of studies around also who gets access to that money. And what we're seeing is that actually people of color are less prone to, BIPOC folks are getting less access to the finances of that. And they find less access, because what we see in the Latino community is that I don't want to call the police. I'm going to lose my family because my family is going to banish me. I'm going to have to deal with the brunt of all of like my life changes. And the reality is that I don't feel safe around CSPD. In the Black community, we see the same thing, right? Because the reality is that we also believe victims are supposed to look very masculine in these situations, even when it is a heterosexual situation, right? So, but that doesn't necessarily mean that men feel like they can, or people that identify as a male believe that they can go to the police, right? Particularly if they're Black or Latino or BIPOC. It hasn't been the safest place in the world. Let's be real. So we're definitely seeing those numbers also statistically when we look at all the data.
Yeah, I just want to let people know I put some numbers in the chat if you're interested. Keep in mind, as always, underreported. These are official numbers based on reports. We know it's severely underreported, but in case you're interested, and also the numbers are from 2013. That's the quickest I could pull up. But if you are interested in like the numbers specifically in the city, I put it in the chat.
Thank you so much, Anna, and for all the panelists for giving the context. So just for the sake of time, I think I'll just like have one question for like the rest of the discussion. So in the context of COVID-19, I know several panelists have already addressed this. So how are you making an impact on this issue, specifically given how isolation and community building can be really difficult with the pandemic and everything happening right now? So how and why do you feel others should get involved with these efforts?
So from a COVID-19 standpoint, initially everyone's saying that their hotline calls have increased. We have actually found our hotline calls have decreased, except for from other agencies. Other agencies are calling us constantly because everybody's tapped. And the reason that I feel like these calls are decreased is not because violence has gone down, it's because it's not safe to call. If you are socially distancing at home with your abuser, where are you going to get that time to make a safe phone call? You're not going to be going necessarily to work where you could take a quick phone call. You can't necessarily send a quick email for outreach. So it's hit and miss a lot of the time as far as reporting during the pandemic, but because people still have needs during this time frame. So we've been able to, especially earlier on when a lot more people were on a harder core lockdown than they are now, we started coming up with different ways to get to people's houses in a non-invasive way. So we would take food boxes every week to people. And then that way it gave us a time to check in, put eyes on them, make sure that they were safe, make sure that abusers weren't around. And especially if they know that you're working from home and you have a stalker or an abuser, it's really easy for them to find you. It's really easy for them to terrorize you in a completely different way because there's nowhere for you to get away from them. Also, violence goes up when stressors go up. So as there's kids working, doing e-learning from home, and that is a whole hot mess that we could do a whole other panel on about those expectations. But when the kids are home stressed, the parents are home stressed, financially, people might be out of work. These are all escalating. Not that these are justifications, but they're escalating already volatile situations. So it's actually scarier during COVID-19 because people don't have the outlets they normally do. So for our program, we decided, how can we fix this? Like, how can we get outreach to our community? So we started thinking like just in different ways, where we came up with a women's group that is half our community and half our caseload. No one knows who's who except for me and my coworker. And that way we're making constant social events, whether they're on Zoom calls. We're doing women's hand drum songs via Zoom. We have all these different cultural events. We did ribbon skirt working, we did native voter registration. All these things are not related to domestic violence in any way, so that there's no reason for someone to be like, well, why are you going to that? Who's going to be there? Because it's just safe community stuff. And so we've been able to outreach to people doing that. We've been opening up our donation center to people in our community, having them come in and get household items, and doing an intake at that same time. So we've been kind of really thinking out of the box that way. Instead of, we used to do women's groups every other week, and in the summer we decided to start doing kayaking for women's groups, because boats are 10 feet long and you can only put one person on a boat, so that's automatically socially distant, and you can talk about things that you on a boat that you wouldn't maybe talk about in a conference room. So the COVID-19 has really made it challenging, but I feel like our program has specifically gotten way more effective because we're doing all of these extra things that we may not have thought about doing in the same kind of way that we're doing it now. So for COVID-19, violence has gone through the roof. The levels of violence are also, I feel, heightened. So it's not domestic violence, and not to in any way downplay like any levels of domestic violence, but it's when they're being physically abused, it's horrifically being physically abused. We're seeing a lot of more calls from the hospitals. I live right by Memorial Hospital, so I get calls 24/7 from their SANE team. So I've noticed that there's a definite uptick in the numbers of calls that we're getting for sexual assault responses. So it's pretty scary of what's going on out there, that people don't see it somehow, and I don't understand how they don't see it. So
yeah, for sure. Those are definitely a lot of the ways that our programs had been reaching out to us for TA and kind of creatively thinking outside of the box. So Monycka, if you want to connect so we can do something around the stuff you are doing. But that's a lot of what we did. We held at the beginning, like in March to June even, we held a lot of member calls where folks could call in, join Zoom. I mean, back then we didn't have Zoom. We were using Google Meet. We were doing whatever we could when we didn't have all of this well put together platform to kind of just pool knowledge together, kind of free think, okay, what are you doing? Oh, what are the issues that you're seeing? And a lot of that was around, how do we make sure that people are getting the help that they need? One of the really neat things we saw and heard about was like really utilizing social media in different ways. And there was this one thing going around that you all may have seen of like, there's a lot of people that are, selling candles or, wraps or whatever the case may be. And so what folks started doing was started saying, hey, if you ever need anything and you can't say, hey, I need help, private message me, DM me and say, hey, I'm looking for these products and I don't sell those products. And so I know that I'm reaching out to you for help. So there were some really creative things happening with programs for outreach in that way. We had a lot of conversations about like confidentiality and maintaining confidentiality and which platforms folks were able to use for counseling services. When there was a lot of stuff happening both in the advocates and the counselors' lives, as well as the participants, right? Of like, I'm working from home, maybe my partner is also working from home and my child is going to school. How do I have a confidential conversation with someone through a video platform or a phone call? So there were a lot of conversations around that too, about considerations for confidentiality and privacy for folks. And really just shifting to that virtual realm, how you know, there was a lot of Zoom bombing that was happening at the very beginning, and Zoom did a lot of things to kind of mitigate that with passwords and the waiting room and all of that stuff. And so really figuring out and talking to programs about how to do that outreach without getting Zoom bombed and protecting the community and still being able to have those conversations. So yeah, a lot of creativity happening in programs.
I think for Inside Out, it's been a duality. It's been like a really good thing because it has given us access in a time when everybody wants to talk about Black Lives Matter and wants to talk about queer people and trans people dying. They actually want to have that conversation. We usually have to like blow open the door. But we're living in a time that right now people are like, wait, what is going on with the queer community? So in some ways that has been really helpful. I would say the most difficult part that we have had is accessing young people to have a safe space. You know what I mean? Now they're stuck at home with their parents, which might be a very toxic situation, and they might never have an opportunity to come out or be themselves or have that space where they can gender express, where they can see other peers being their freest self. So up to a certain degree, we haven't had that opportunity. We do have Discord, and that has its function, and that has been really helpful, but we have seen a huge number go down. So one of the things that we did have to get creative with was that we started collaborating with other organizations. Like for instance, we're collaborating right now with The Place, and our space is actually open for young people that are houseless, because 30% of our youth were houseless, whoever we were serving when we were open. So the goal was to kind of have food and have spaces where you could possibly tell us that you are seeing abuse of some sort. We don't talk enough about the houseless community seeing a lot of abuse on a regular basis. And we do have a huge population here of young people that are between the age of generally, I would say around 13 to 14 and 24. During COVID, we decided we were going to extend the youth that we were going to serve, because we noticed that the cost of living in Colorado Springs is ridiculous, and young people that are coming out of high school and college cannot afford it. And so we're seeing also some behaviors around being in toxic relationships because of codependency, financial codependency, realistically speaking. So we kind of shifted, and now we actually we used to serve to 22, now we serve to 24. We have a young adult specialist, which is helping young people get access to jobs, because a lot of our young people worked in the restaurant industry or in retail, and they lost their jobs. As we're seeing those numbers really deplete. And then on top of that, a lot of them just don't have access to a lot of other resources because of transportation. Like we have terrible transportation. So we started to deliver food boxes to and service our young people like that too. We also started a COVID relief fund where they could apply and get money for to keep their lights on and to pay for rent. And we've also done a lot of fundraising around hotel rooms, to be honest, because not only the cold season, but again, these behaviors of, unfortunately, people are living in tents in parks, right? And they're being sexually assaulted. We have recently brought some bikes for young people because we did one of our hot spottings, and we realized that, guess what? If a homeless person has a bike, particularly a female person, they're less prone to see sexual violence in the streets because they can drive off versus them walking. Which is a huge issue in our city because we don't have enough city lights. We also don't have enough street walks, right? Like literally the sidewalks are not really sidewalks. These are all things that we've noticed are a piece of sexual violence, particularly in the houseless community, and particularly when we talk about equity around classism. So we're still working through all of that. Again, it's had its like really great moments where I'm talking to like San Luis Valley and their CSPD, I mean their PD like department, right? Which we would never have access to that. And then on the flip side, we're seeing high numbers of unemployment and abuse.
I'll speak very quickly to people, to CC students interested in what's going on campus or not on campus, but as you might suspect, reports went down a lot last year, which was somewhat, expected because people weren't on campus. However, we also worried that with a lot of action being moved to Zoom and online about people not recognizing online harassment and things like that as something they can go to the school for help for. So that's like one concern we were having. As far as my job, it changed a teeny bit because I was working with a lot of people, students scattered across the country who were either having problems at home or something happened there. So my job changed a little bit where I was doing a lot of research to get people connected to their local resources. I think it's important for them to have access to the local advocates and such. So that's a little bit how, I don't know, my day-to-day changed in the past year.
Yeah, thank you all for answering the question. So now I want to open up the space to more students or the attendees questions. So we have one in the chat. Could you please speak to any involvement your organizations have had with restorative justice? Have you been involved at all with a PASO domestic violence problem-solving court?
We've worked with the Rocket Docket, which is essentially what the DV court is called, and it's under Judge Miles. So domestic violence perpetrators have a choice on occasion to work within the Rocket Docket or DV court, and they get more intensive services. You never want to take a survivor into that courtroom. It is, I don't know if Tyescha or anyone has been into that courtroom, but it seems very abuser-centered in a way that it's necessarily not. But when you first walk in and the judge is like, "Hey, Mike, what's up? You're looking good." Like, you're like, "What the," But it's because they have a different relationship. So they have to go to therapy. They have to go to group. They give them way more intensive criteria as far as to deal with some of the issues that cause domestic violence. I don't think many of them are very much not effective. But if they don't comply, they go immediately to what their jail sentence would have been. So, and if they complete that Rocket Docket and do all of those criteria, and they go to their anger management and they go to their DV classes and they do substance abuse, they do all those things that are court ordered. In some cases, those sentences can be deferred. So essentially, it never happened. So I understand the concept behind it, that you really want to force people to get these intensive services so that they don't keep perpetrating. But can you really do those life-changing, relearning your toxic masculinity upbringing in a 6 to 8 week course? Probably not. So, I mean, that's hardcore self-work that I don't think is happening. I mean, and also that something that I don't consider domestic violence, the courts may. I look at, the definition of, is it a pattern of coercive behavior and fear? If it's a one-time only situation, is that necessarily domestic violence? Could it be an assault? We have a scenario where someone walks in, catches their partner cheating on them, knocks their partner right out. There has never been a history of violence in that family before. The victim of the assault didn't live in fear. They didn't worry about their safety, none of those things. But in the court size, that's still domestic violence because they were involved. So a lot of things get lumped together within the DV court. And in Colorado Springs, we don't have one courtroom or one judge that handles all DV cases. They're dispersed out all over the place. So I can be, when I go to court with our participants, I can be in a different courtroom every day of the week. And the worst courtroom to sit in is when you watch people go in and apply for modifications of their temporary protection orders. And it's all day long. So people get protection orders and then they come in and it's always the survivor. and is always like, I'd like to modify the court. I'd like to let him come back home. I'd like to let him do this. And it's 9 times out of 10, it's because he has convinced her to tell the judge that, or there's some level of financial abuse and she's not able to make her rent or her daycare or any of those things. And so the judge will waive those protection orders, and it goes away. And then 6 months later, 3 months later, the cycle starts right back over again. And there's no one, I've never seen DV advocates in that courtroom. I've seen them when they're in there getting the protection order, but where are the people offering support for those women who are so desperate to meet basic needs that they're willing to let an abuser back in their home? No one's doing that. So El Paso County is better than some other counties as far as the judges having a better understanding of trauma and domestic violence. Not all of them though. There are some of them who are phenomenal, and I'm like, and when I leave the courtroom, I'm like, and I'm so grateful for some of them, and other ones I'm like, how have you not been voted out yet? What the hell's going on? So the Rocket Docket is interesting. It's open to the public when we're not in a pandemic. So any of these students that are interested in seeing how that works, you can just pull it up online and go hang out in Judge Miles' courtroom and check it out. So that is something that's helpful to do, is to go sit in some of these courtrooms and see how these protection ordered processes work, what these women have to go through. And, again, I don't mean to, it is, the majority of our survivors are women. That is not the only case. I understand that. But yeah, all of that is open to the public. So you can see how that works yourselves.
Yeah, go ahead, Maria.
Sorry, I was just going to mention, it certainly is a very nuanced issue and a nuanced conversation, especially when it comes to sexualized violence. There's been a lot of conversation and pushback about applying that to this particular issue. And also, it's so important given the context of the world that we're in right now, and always with the way that the criminal justice system isn't really justice. And so figuring out different ways that communities have been doing some of this restorative justice work already, and finding ways to heal communities that aren't entrenched in this colonial structure, in this very biased, unequal, inequitable system. And so Sexuality is undertaking quite a bit of conversation around restorative justice and what that looks like, and when it works and when it doesn't work. What are the considerations that we're talking about because of that anti-oppression lens? Again, in this context that we're living in right now, it's important, right? And so today was the first monthly ongoing RJ conversation that CICASA hosted. So my colleague Jenna Harper, she's leading those conversations. She put together a summit in December, a 2-day summit around restorative justice, what that means, what that could look like. So if you're interested, definitely reach out to us if you want to be part of those RJ conversations and what it looks like, because it is super nuanced, right? There's certain instances like Monycka was talking about that it's not going to work, and in other cases where that's the only thing that's going to work. So important conversations to have.
I know.
Maria, would you share the link of that summit to the chat box so students or who might be interested can look it up? That's, yeah, great resource.
I know that we're in the sake of time, but I have been in those rooms like Monycka, and I think one of the hardest parts to see is that women, and I'm sorry, usually they are women, right? Don't have like literally no resource. Like there's no resource. Sometimes there's nothing they can do. I've sat with many women, particularly in the Black community, because we get reached out. I'm the chair president of the Black, the Empowerment Solidarity Network. And so in that role, we get a lot of different needs in the Black community, because there is an organization that just meets the Black needs community, right? Like that's the reality. And sitting there and seeing women that are like, the justice system has exploited them up to a certain degree, right? Like they're coming in, they can only get but so many structures. And then sometimes there's a manipulation of children involved, in which this person is like, I need to see my kids. But we have these adjustments, right? And then money being used, and there's just a limited amount of resource. And I have worked on the school to prison pipeline around restorative justice. And the scary part about restorative justice is that you do have to restore everything foundationally, right? But the problem is that we're trying to do it in this upper level place, kind of what Maria was saying, like there has to be a healing of some sort, right? And we have to be building a structure that's literally uprooting everything in restorative justice, because when you only do it in these cases where you're like, oh, take all of these classes, and this is the problem with our judicial system, right? We do this like step-by-step process, and it's supposed to work for everyone when humans don't function that way. We're not linear, right? And so what's happening is that people are checking all the boxes and they're still coming out, and we're still seeing second cases. And then also, to me, financially, we're just giving too much money to the people that are hurting other people. Like, the victims don't have a lot of resources outside of Tyescha, like, you know what I mean? And even those resources are super limited. So I say all that to say that we're in dire need of better policy. And when you say restorative justice, I think that it's a cool word, it's trendy, but the reality of what that looks like structurally has to be like embedded in everything that we do. And I don't think we're anywhere near that.
We always talk about how we have to, like, if we have this table and we're sitting at this table, we want to throw the table over, upset, and just restart, get rid of the system, stir shit up is what we talk about.
Well, thank you all so much for sharing. If other attendees have questions, I would assume the panelists are open to like answering them, maybe through email, or maybe just shoot them an email or ask about other like opportunities or engagement, like potential engagement with the work they're doing right now. So if our panelists have any opportunities, if it will be useful for the attendees today, feel free to just drop them in the chat box, and I'll also make sure to send the email out to everybody today. And yeah, thank you all the panelists for your time and sharing your experiences. I've learned a lot in this panel, and I know a lot of students in this panel are also doing work at CC, and hopefully they've also learned a lot from all of you. And thank you all who attend this panel and listening today. And we'll share a link in the chat box soon, so you can all sign up to the coalition's listserv. And if we have other panels or events like this one, yes, that's the link. And feel free to just sign